A powerful real estate mogul, Isabella Montero, stumbles upon a homeless man and his infant grandchildren, only to realize he's Mateus, the love she lost 30 years ago. As secrets unravel and old enemies resurface, will they reclaim their past or lose everything? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The cold night air bit through Isabella Montero's expensive cashmere coat as she walked alone through the downtown streets. At 52, she was at the height of her career, the undisputed queen of real estate in the city, with properties spanning 3 states and a fortune that made her one of the wealthiest women in the country. Yet tonight, like most nights, she felt empty. Her high heels clicked against the pavement as she left her company's charity gala early. The faces, the fake smiles, the endless networking, it all felt so hollow lately. "Ms. Montero, should I bring the car around?" Her driver's voice came through her phone. "No, Carlos. I need some air. I'll call when I'm ready," she replied, ending the call quickly. Isabella passed gleaming storefronts and busy restaurants, invisible to the people rushing by. Her mind wandered to the board meeting tomorrow, where she'd announced the acquisition of the Rivera hotel chain. Another victory, another expansion of her empire. As she turned down a quieter street near the old bank building, something caught her eye, a figure huddled in the shadows of a doorway. She would have kept walking, but a soft cry made her pause. There, on a flattened cardboard box, sat a man with 2 small bundles cradled in his arms. Babies. The man was rocking them gently, whispering something Isabella couldn't hear. "Sir, do you need help?" she asked, surprising herself with the question. She usually left her charitable actions to her foundation, not direct involvement. The man looked up, his face partially hidden by an unkempt beard and dirt. But those eyes, Isabella felt her heart stop. Eyes she would recognize anywhere, even after 30 years. Mateus. The name fell from her lips before she could stop it. The man squinted, tilting his head as he studied her face. Recognition slowly dawned in his expression. Isabella Montero? Is that really you?" She stepped closer, her legs suddenly unsteady. The world around them faded away as memories crashed through the walls she'd built around her heart. Matias Rodriguez, her first love, her only true love, the man she'd planned to marry before ambition and family expectations tore them apart. "What happened to you?" she whispered, taking in his ragged clothes and thin frame. Mateus adjusted the babies in his arms, who couldn't be more than a few months old. "Life happened," he answered with a faint smile that didn't reach his eyes. "These are my grandchildren, Isa, Sofia, and Miguel." "Grandchildren?" Isabella repeated, still trying to process seeing him after all these years. "My daughter, Elena. She died last month. Cancer." His voice cracked. "Their father disappeared when he found out she was pregnant. I'm all they have now." One of the babies began to cry, a thin wail that pierced the night air. "They're hungry," Mateus said, the worry evident in his voice. "I lost my job at the construction site after taking too many days off to care for Elena. Then I couldn't make rent. We've been on the streets for 2 weeks now." Isabella knelt down beside him, not caring about her designer dress touching the dirty sidewalk. "When did you last eat, Mateus?" He looked away. "I got some bread from the shelter yesterday." Without hesitation, she pulled out her phone. "Carlos, I need you here now, corner of Willow and 5th. "You don't have to," Mateus began. "Yes, I do," Isabella interrupted. As she waited for her driver, she noticed something on Mateus's left hand, a worn gold band. Her heart skipped a beat. It was identical to the one she'd given him all those years ago, on the night they promised each other forever. "You kept it," she said softly, reaching out to touch the ring. Mateus nodded. Some promises are worth keeping, even when everything else falls apart. The sleek black car pulled up to the curb and Carlos stepped out, his eyes widening at the scene before him. "We're taking them home," Isabella said firmly, helping Mateus to his feet. "Isa, I can't accept charity," Mateus said, his pride still intact despite his circumstances. She looked directly into his eyes. "This isn't charity, Mateus. This is me fixing a mistake I made 30 years ago when I let you walk away." In the car, Isabella watched as Mateus held the twins close. The same hands that had once held hers with such tenderness now cradled these innocent lives with fierce protection. "What happened to us, Isa?" he asked quietly as the city lights flashed by outside the window. "We were young," she replied. "I chose my father's approval and the business over what my heart wanted. And you—" "I refused to be the reason you gave up your dreams," he finished. "So I let you go." The twins had fallen asleep, their tiny faces peaceful despite the turmoil around them. "And after?" Isabella asked. "You disappeared. I moved to Phoenix, started over, married Elena's mother, but it didn't last. I raised Elena alone," he explained. "I followed your success from afar. Every article, every interview, you became exactly what you wanted to be." "Not exactly," Isabella admitted, looking out the window. The car pulled up to the gates of Isabella's estate. Mateus stared in awe at the mansion that loomed ahead, its windows glowing with warm light against the darkness. "Welcome to my empty palace," Isabella said with a hint of bitterness. 20 bedrooms, and I sleep alone." Inside, Rosa, Isabella's housekeeper for the past 15 years, rushed forward when she saw the unexpected guests. "Dios mío, babies!" she exclaimed, her motherly instincts immediately taking over. "They need baths, warm milk, clean clothes." "Rosa, this is Mateus and his grandchildren. They'll be staying with us," Isabella announced, her tone making it clear this wasn't open for discussion. While Rosa took charge of the twins, Isabella showed Mateus to one of the guest suites. "There's a bathroom through there. Clean clothes will be on the bed, take your time." When Mateus emerged from the shower, he looked like a different man. Without the dirt and with his beard trimmed, Isabella could see the face she'd once memorized with her fingertips. Older now, lined with worry and hardship, but still Mateus. "They're sleeping," Rosa announced, appearing at the door. "Poor angels. We're exhausted. I've put them in the blue room, made a temporary crib with pillows. We'll need real cribs tomorrow." "Thank you, Rosa. Please order everything the babies will need. Cribs, clothes, formula, toys, everything," Isabella instructed. After Rosa left, an awkward silence fell between them. 30 years of life, decisions, and regrets stood like a wall between where they were and where they might have been. "You hungry?" Isabella finally asked. "Starving," Mateus admitted with a small smile. In the kitchen, Isabella surprised herself by making sandwiches. She, who had personal chefs at her beck and call, wanted to do this simple act for him with her own hands. "Remember when we used to make midnight sandwiches at your parents' beach house?" Mateus asked, watching her. Isabella smiled at the memory. "Turkey and avocado for you. Ham and Swiss for me." "You remember," he said, sounding surprised. "I remember everything, Mateus." As they ate, they filled in the gaps of their lives. Mateus had worked construction most of his life, eventually becoming a foreman before the company downsized. He'd poured everything into raising Elena after her mother left when she was 7. "She was brilliant," he said, his eyes clouding with grief. "Got a scholarship to study nursing. Then the diagnosis came, stage 4 by the time they found it. The twins were born just 2 months before she—" He couldn't finish. Isabella reached across the table and took his hand. "I'm so sorry, Mateus." "What about you?" he asked, clearly wanting to change the subject. "No husband, children?" Isabella shook her head. "I married Richard Hayes when I was 30, a business merger more than a marriage. Divorced after 5 years. No children." She didn't mention the miscarriage that had been the final blow to her loveless marriage. "The great Isabella Montero, all alone in her castle," Mateus said without mockery, just a sad understanding. "Not alone tonight," she replied. Later, as they checked on the sleeping twins, Mateus turned to her. "We can't stay, Isa. I need to find work, get back on my feet." "You will," she assured him. "But Sofia and Miguel need stability now. Stay until you get things sorted out. I have connections, Mateus. I can help." "I don't want your charity," he repeated. "Then call it repaying a debt," Isabella challenged. "You gave up everything for me once. Let me do this for you now." Before he could argue further, his phone rang, an old flip phone that looked ancient next to Isabella's sleek smartphone. The call was brief, but his face fell as he listened. "That was the shelter. Someone broke into my locker and stole what little we had left, he said after hanging up. Our clothes, Elena's photo album, the twins' birth certificates, everything. Isabella made a decision then. Stay at least until you get new documents for the twins, please, Mateus. After a long moment, he nodded. Okay, but I want to earn my keep. I can do maintenance, gardening, whatever you need. We'll figure it out tomorrow, she said, relieved. Get some sleep. As Isabella prepared for bed in her own room, she found herself standing at the window, looking out at the garden where the moonlight cast silver shadows across the lawn. For the first time in years, her house felt like it might become a home. Meanwhile, across town in a luxurious penthouse, Richard Hayes, Isabella's ex-husband, ended a phone call with a satisfied smile. Montero Enterprises will be announcing the Rivera acquisition tomorrow, he told the woman lounging on his couch, which means her focus will be divided. Perfect timing, the woman replied, twirling a strand of blonde hair around her finger. The board is already concerned about her recent erratic behavior. Now we just need to push a little harder. Patience, Victoria, Richard cautioned. We've waited 10 years for this revenge. A few more months won't hurt. Speak for yourself, Victoria Rivera spat. That woman destroyed my father. I want to see her empire crumble and her name in the mud. Richard refilled their champagne glasses. And you will, but everything must appear above board. No one can suspect we're behind it. Victoria raised her glass in a toast. To Isabella Montero's downfall. May she lose everything just as she made others lose. As they drank to Isabella's destruction, neither knew that fate had already dealt an unexpected card, one that might change the game entirely. Back at the mansion, Isabella slipped into the blue room where the twins slept. Mateus had fallen asleep, in the armchair beside them, his hand protectively resting on the makeshift crib. She gently covered him with a blanket, allowing her fingers to lightly brush his cheek. I never stopped loving you, she whispered, words she couldn't say while he was awake. Maybe this time we'll get it right. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows slightly. A storm was coming in more ways than one. Morning sunlight streamed through the windows of the blue room, where Mateus awoke with a start. For a moment, panic gripped him as he looked around the unfamiliar surroundings. Then he saw the twins, sleeping peacefully in their makeshift crib, and the events of the previous night came rushing back. Isabella. After all these years, fate had brought them together again. The door opened quietly and Rosa entered with a tray of coffee. Good morning, Mr. Rodriguez, she said warmly. Ms. Montero asked me to bring you breakfast. She had to leave early for an important meeting, but said she'll be back by afternoon. Thank you, Mateus replied, accepting the cup gratefully. And please call me Mateus, Rosa smiled. The babies slept through the night, that's a blessing. It is, he agreed, looking at his grandchildren with love. They've been through so much already. Children are stronger than we think, Rosa said, her eyes kind, and now they have a roof over their heads and people who care for them. As if on cue, little Miguel began to stir, his tiny fists clenching as he woke up hungry. Sophia followed, moments later, and soon both babies were crying for their morning bottle. Let me help you, Rosa offered, lifting Miguel with practiced ease. I raised 5 children of my own, believe me, I know what I'm doing. For the first time in weeks, Mateus felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He wasn't alone anymore. Across town, Isabella sat at the head of the conference table, surrounded by her executive team. On the surface, she was the picture of confidence in her tailored suit, not a hair out of place, but her mind kept drifting to the man and babies sleeping. In her home, Miss Montero, her assistant prompted gently. They're ready for your announcement. Isabella straightened in her chair. Ladies and gentlemen, as you know, we've been in negotiations with Rivera Hotels for some time now. Today, I'm pleased to announce that Montero Enterprises has successfully acquired the entire chain, including all 36 properties across the country. Applause filled the room, but Isabella noticed one person who wasn't clapping, George Winston, her CFO and longest-serving executive. This acquisition represents our largest expansion. To date, she continued, the formal announcement will be made to the press tomorrow morning. After the meeting, George followed her into her office, closing the door behind him. "Isabella, we need to talk," he said, dispensing with formalities. After 20 years of working together, they had that privilege. "About?" she asked, though she already knew. "The board is concerned about the Rivera deal. We're extending ourselves too far, too fast," George explained. "And there are rumors that Richard has been meeting with some of our investors." Isabella's eyes narrowed. "Richard doesn't have the clout to sway our investors. He does if he's working with someone who does," George countered. "I've heard he's been seen with Victoria Rivera." Antonio Rivera's daughter? Isabella felt a cold knot form in her stomach. Antonio had been the founder of Rivera Hotels, and she had outmaneuvered him in a hostile takeover that ultimately led to his financial ruin and, according to rumors, his suicide. "The very same," George confirmed. "And she's made no secret of blaming you for her father's death." Isabella sank into her chair. "What exactly are you hearing, George?" "That they're looking for weaknesses, ways to undermine your control of the company," he said. "The board's confidence is already shaky after the Westlake project losses. If they can prove you're making reckless decisions—" "I'm not," Isabella insisted. "The Rivera acquisition is sound." George sighed. "Just be careful, Isabella. You've worked too hard to lose it all now." After he left, Isabella stared out the window at the city skyline, a landscape she had helped shape with her buildings and developments. She had sacrificed everything for this empire, including her chance at happiness with Mateus. And now, just as he had unexpectedly returned to her life, it was all under threat. Back at the mansion, deliveries had been arriving all morning. Cribs, baby clothes, diapers, toys, and everything else 2 infants could possibly need. Mateus watched in amazement as Rosa efficiently organized it all, transforming one of the bedrooms into a proper nursery. "This is too much," he protested weakly. "Ms. Montero insisted," Rosa replied as she assembled a state-of-the-art changing table. "She said the babies deserve the best." Mateus picked up a tiny blue sweater, rubbing the soft fabric between his fingers. "My Elena never had things this nice," he said quietly. "I tried, but there was never enough money." Rosa paused in her work, giving him a sympathetic look. "You did your best, that's all any parent can do." Was it, he questioned, the guilt he'd carried since Elena's diagnosis surfacing again? "If I had been able to afford better doctors, earlier treatments—" "Stop," Rosa said firmly. "My husband died of cancer 10 years ago. The best doctors, the most expensive treatments, sometimes nothing can change what God has planned." Mateus nodded, swallowing hard against the lump in his throat. "How long have you worked for Isabella?" 15 years, Rosa answered as she resumed setting up the nursery. "I've seen her build an empire, but I've never seen her truly happy. Not until last night, when she brought you and these angels home." This revelation left Mateus silent. The Isabella he remembered had been full of life and laughter. Ambitious, yes, but also passionate about everything she did. Had success come at the cost of her happiness? His thoughts were interrupted by the doorbell. Rosa excused herself to answer it, returning moments later with a concerned expression. "There's a man at the door asking for you," she said. "Says his name is Derek Johnson and that he's from Child Protective Services." Mateus felt his heart drop. The twins! Rosa's eyes filled with understanding. "I'll bring him to the sitting room. Take a minute to compose yourself." When Mateus entered the sitting room, he found a stern-looking man in a cheap suit waiting for him. "Mr. Rodriguez?" the man asked, extending his hand. "I'm Derek Johnson from CPS. We received a report about 2 infants in your care." "My grandchildren," Mateus confirmed, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "Yes, Sofia and Miguel Rodriguez," Johnson said, consulting his notes. "Your daughter Elena Rodriguez passed away last month, correct?" "Yes, from cancer. And the children's father?" "Unknown," Mateus replied. "He left when he found out Elena was pregnant." Johnson nodded, making a note. "Mr. Rodriguez, our records show you've been homeless for the past 2 weeks, is that correct?" "It was," Mateus acknowledged. "But as you can see, our situation has changed." "So I see," Johnson said, looking around the luxurious room skeptically. "And your relationship with Ms. Montero is—" "We're old friends," Mateus answered, unwilling to delve into their complicated history. "Old friends," Johnson repeated, clearly unconvinced. "Mr. Rodriguez, I need to ensure these children are in a stable environment. Do you have legal guardianship?" "Elena named me their guardian in her will," Mateus said. "I have the papers, had the papers. They were stolen 2 nights ago, along with our other belongings." Johnson made another note. "Without documentation, and given your recent housing instability, I'm afraid I'll need to recommend temporary placement for the children until we can verify your claims." "No!" Mateus protested. "They just lost their mother. I'm all they have." "I understand your concern, but my priority is the welfare of these children," Johnson insisted. "What seems to be the problem here?" Isabella's voice cut through the tension as she entered the room. She had returned from her meeting earlier than expected, and her presence immediately commanded attention. Johnson stood up straighter. "Ms. Montero, I'm Derek Johnson from Child Protective Services. I'm here about the 2 infants currently in Mr. Rodriguez's care." "Sophia and Miguel," Isabella supplied. "Yes, they're staying in my home along with their grandfather, who is their legal guardian." "So I've been told," Johnson replied, "but without documentation, which can be replaced," Isabella interrupted smoothly. "I've already contacted my attorney, who is working on obtaining copies of all necessary documents, including Elena Rodriguez's will and the children's birth certificates." Johnson seemed taken aback by her efficiency. "Even so, Ms. Montero, there are procedures that must be followed. Mr. Rodriguez's recent homelessness was a temporary setback which has been resolved," Isabella finished for him. "Mr. Rodriguez has accepted a position as the property manager for my estate, which includes housing for him and his grandchildren. My attorney will provide a copy of the employment contract and lease agreement." Mateus stared at her in surprise. This was the first he'd heard of any job offer. Johnson hesitated, clearly torn between following protocol and challenging one of the most powerful women in the city. "Additionally," Isabella continued, "I'd be happy to put you in touch with Dr. Sarah Chen, the pediatrician who will be examining the twins this afternoon. She can confirm they are being well cared for." "You've arranged for a doctor already?" Johnson asked. "Of course," Isabella replied, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "These children have been through traumatic circumstances. Their health and well-being are my top priority." Something in her tone must have convinced him, because Johnson's demeanor softened slightly. "That's commendable, Ms. Montero. If you could have your attorney contact my office with the documentation we discussed, I'll update our report accordingly." After Johnson left, Mateus turned to Isabella. "Property manager, employment contract?" "I may have improvised a bit," she admitted with a small smile. "But I meant what I said about the job. This estate needs a full-time manager, and you need work. It's a perfect solution." "Isa, I don't know anything about managing an estate," he protested. "You were a construction foreman," she reminded him. "You know buildings, maintenance, scheduling. The rest you can learn." She took his hand. "Please, Mateus, let me help you." Before he could respond, one of the twins started crying from upstairs. They both hurried to the nursery where Rosa was trying to comfort a fussy Sophia. "I think she has a fever," Rosa said worriedly, placing a hand on the baby's forehead. Isabella immediately pulled out her phone. "I'll call Dr. Chen and have her come right away." Within the hour, Dr. Chen had examined both twins and diagnosed Sophia with a mild ear infection. "It's common in infants," she reassured them. "The antibiotic drops will clear it up in a few days." After the doctor left, Mateus sat beside Sophia's crib, watching her sleep. The medicine had eased her discomfort, and she looked peaceful again. "You were amazing today," he said to Isabella, who stood in the doorway. "With Johnson, with the doctor, you handled everything so efficiently." "Years of practice," she replied, coming to stand beside him. "When you run a company, you learn to manage crises." "Is that all this is to you? A crisis to manage?" he asked, quietly. Isabella shook her head. "No, Mateus, I don't know what this is yet, but it's not just a problem to solve." He looked up at her, seeing the vulnerability behind her polished exterior. "Why are you really doing all this, Isa?" "Because 30 years ago, I made the biggest mistake of my life," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I chose ambition over love. And every day since, I've wondered what my life would have been like if I'd chosen differently. Mateus stood, closing the distance between them. We can't go back, Isa. I know, she said. But maybe we can start from where we are now. The moment was interrupted by Rosa, who appeared with a cordless phone. Ms. Montero, it's Mr. Winston. He says it's urgent. Isabella took the call, her expression growing more serious by the second. I'll be right there, she said, finally hanging up. I have to go back to the office. There's an emergency board meeting. Is everything okay? Mateus asked, concerned by her sudden tension. I'm not sure, she admitted. George wouldn't say over the phone, but it didn't sound good. She hesitated. Will you be all right with the twins? We'll be fine, he assured her. Rosa's been a godsend. Isabella nodded, visibly torn between her responsibilities at work and her desire to stay. I'll be back as soon as I can. After she left, Mateus rejoined Rosa in the nursery. She works too hard, he observed. Always has, Rosa agreed. That company is her life. It shouldn't be, Mateus said softly, more to himself than to Rosa. When Isabella arrived at Montero Enterprises headquarters, she found the boardroom already full. Her stomach tightened when she saw Richard Hayes sitting at the far end of the table, looking smugly confident. What is he doing here? She demanded, addressing George. He requested to address the board, George explained grimly. As a significant shareholder, he has that right. Isabella took her seat at the head of the table, refusing to show any sign of intimidation. Very well, let's get this over with. Richard stood, buttoning his expensive suit jacket. Ladies and gentlemen of the board, thank you for convening on such short notice. I've asked to speak with you today because I have serious concerns about the direction Montero Enterprises is taking under its current leadership. Get to the point, Richard, Isabella said coldly. Certainly, he replied with a thin smile. It has come to my attention that the Rivera Hotel acquisition was pushed through without proper due diligence. Specifically, that environmental reports for at least 3 of the properties were falsified to hide significant contamination issues. A murmur ran through the board members. That's a serious accusation, George said. Do you have evidence? I do, Richard confirmed, distributing folders to each board member. These are the original environmental reports obtained by a concerned party who wishes to remain anonymous. Isabella opened her folder, scanning the documents with growing horror. If these reports were authentic, the cleanup costs would run into the millions. This is the first I'm hearing of any contamination issues, she said, fighting to keep her voice steady. That's concerning, said Margaret Davis, the head of the audit committee. As CEO, you should have been aware of these reports before finalizing the acquisition. Because there were no such reports, Isabella insisted, these must be fabricated. Are you suggesting I forged official environmental agency documents? Richard asked, feigning offense. That would be a serious allegation, Isabella. She glared at him, seeing the trap he'd set. If she accused him of forgery without proof, she'd appear desperate and paranoid. If she didn't challenge the documents, she'd appear negligent. I'm suggesting that the board should verify the authenticity of these reports before jumping to conclusions, she said carefully. A reasonable request, George agreed, coming to her defense. I move that we suspend judgment until an independent verification can be conducted. The board voted to approve George's motion, but Isabella could see the damage was already done. Doubt had been planted, and Richard knew it. While we're awaiting verification, Richard continued smoothly, I'd like to raise another matter of concern. It has come to my attention that Ms. Montero has recently taken in a homeless man and 2 infants, providing them housing on her estate. Isabella felt the blood drain from her face. How could he possibly know about Mateus and the twins already? My personal life is not the board's concern, she said icily. It becomes the board's concern when your judgment is questionable, Richard countered. Making rash decisions personally raises questions about your decision-making professionally. This is outrageous, George protested. Is it? Richard challenged. First the Westlake project losses, now potentially overlooked environmental issues, with Rivera, and a sudden personal entanglement with a homeless man. The pattern suggests instability. The boardroom fell silent, all eyes on Isabella. If you have nothing further, Mr. Hayes, I believe this meeting is adjourned, she said, standing up. Her voice was calm, but inside she was seething. As the board members filed out, Margaret Davis lingered. Isabella, as your friend, I have to ask, is everything all right? These accusations are part of Richard's vendetta against me, Isabella. Finished. He's never forgiven me for the divorce. Margaret nodded sympathetically. Just be careful. The board respects you, but they also have a duty to the shareholders. After everyone had gone, George returned to find Isabella still sitting in the boardroom, staring at the documents Richard had provided. It's a setup, she said, without looking up. It has to be. I agree, George replied, sitting beside her. But how did he get these reports? And how did he know about your house guests so quickly? Isabella shook her head. I don't know, but I'm going to find out. Back at the mansion, Mateus had just gotten both twins to sleep when he heard the front door slam. He found Isabella in the living room pacing angrily. What happened? He asked, alarmed by her agitation. Richard happened, she spat. My ex-husband is trying to destroy me. She explained about the board meeting, the accusations, and how Richard had somehow learned about Mateus and the twins. He must have had me followed, she concluded. It's the only explanation. Mateus listened quietly, then asked, why would he go to such lengths after all this time? Because I humiliated him, Isabella admitted. When I divorced him, I exposed his affairs, his embezzlement from company funds. He lost his reputation, his position on the board. He's been rebuilding ever since, waiting for his chance at revenge. And now he's using me to get it, Mateus realized. Isa, maybe we should leave. I don't want to cause you more problems. No, she said firmly, taking his hands. That's exactly what he wants. If I send you away, it looks like I'm admitting my judgment was flawed. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the years between them seemed to melt away. Besides, she added, softly, I just found you again. I'm not letting go this time. Before Mateus could respond, his phone rang. He checked the caller ID and frowned. It's the hospital, Elena's hospital, he answered, listened for a moment, then sat down heavily, his face pale. Mateus? What is it? Isabella asked, alarmed. They found something in Elena's room, he said, his voice hollow. A letter she wrote before she died. It's addressed to the twins' father. Did they say what's in it? Mateus shook his head. Just that it's important and I should come get it right away. I'll come with you, Isabella offered immediately. What about your company crisis? It can wait, she said decisively. You shouldn't. Have to face this alone. As they drove to the hospital, neither spoke of the growing connection between them, of the feelings that 30 years apart had failed to diminish. But when Isabella reached over and took Mateus's hand, offering silent support, they both knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, whether from Richard's schemes or the mysteries of Elena's letter, they would face them together. Atwa. The same moment across town, Victoria Rivera raised a glass in a toast with Richard Hayes. Phase 1 complete, she said with satisfaction. Isabella Montero's perfect life is about to come crashing down around her. Richard clinked his glass against hers. And we're just getting started. What neither of them knew was that the letter, waiting at the hospital, contained a secret that would change everything. A truth about the twins' father that would shake the foundations of their carefully laid plans. The hospital corridors felt coldly familiar to Mateus as he and Isabella made their way to the administrative office. These same hallways had witnessed his daughter's final days, her courage, her pain, and ultimately, her goodbye. Now they returned, seeking a message Elena had left behind. Mr. Rodriguez, greeted a middle-aged woman in a grey pantsuit as they entered the office. I'm Patricia Winters, the hospital administrator. Thank you for coming so quickly. This is Isabella Montero, Mateus introduced. She's a close friend. Patricia's eyes widened slightly at the name, clearly recognizing the famous businesswoman. Ms. Montero, a pleasure. Please, both of you, have a seat. Patricia opened a drawer and removed a sealed envelope. This was found behind the nightstand, in your daughter's room when it was being prepared for a new patient. It appears to have fallen there and was overlooked during the room clearing. She handed the envelope to Mateus. His name was written on the front in Elena's handwriting, along with the words, about the twins' father, Important. Thank you for contacting me, Matthias said, his voice tight with emotion as he stared at his daughter's handwriting. Of course, Patricia replied. Elena was special to all of us here. The nurses still talk about her strength. As they left the hospital, Matthias clutched the envelope tightly, making no move to open it. Do you want to read it now? Isabella asked gently as they sat in her car. Matthias shook his head. Not yet. Whatever Elena wanted to tell me about the twins' father. I need to be ready. Isabella nodded, understanding his hesitation. Let's go home then. The word home hung between them, a simple word that carried complex meaning. After just 2 days, they had begun to create something that felt like home, something neither had truly had in years. Back at the mansion, they found Rosa in the nursery with the twins. Sophia's fever had broken, and both babies were contentedly playing on a colorful mat. They missed their grandpa, Rosa said with a warm smile. This little one kept looking at the door. She nodded toward Miguel, who gurgled happily at the sight of Matthias. And this came for you while you were gone, Rosa added, handing Isabella a thick manila envelope. Courier delivered it, said it was urgent. Isabella opened it to find legal documents, copies of Elena's will naming Matthias as the twins' guardian, their birth certificates, and other papers Isabella's attorney had managed to expedite. That was fast, Matthias remarked, momentarily distracted from Elena's letter. Money talks, Isabella replied pragmatically. And Martin is the best attorney in the city. I'll have these sent to Johnson at CPS first thing tomorrow. They settled into a quiet evening routine, feeding the twins, bathing them, and putting them to bed. Working together, they moved with a surprising harmony, as if they had been co-parenting for years rather than days. Later, with the twins asleep, they sat in Isabella's study. The envelope from the hospital lay on the coffee table between them, still unopened. I'm afraid, Matthias admitted, staring at it. What if it's something that will hurt the twins? Or what if their father wants to claim them after all? Whatever it is, we'll face it, Isabella assured him, reaching across to squeeze his hand. Together. Matthias took a deep breath and picked up the envelope. His hands trembled slightly as he broke the seal and unfolded the letter inside. Dear Papa, he read aloud, his voice thick with emotion. If you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you're caring for my beautiful babies. I know they couldn't be in better hands, but there's something you need to know about their father, something I was too ashamed to tell you while I was alive. His name is James Hayes. Yes, Hayes, as in Richard Hayes' son. We met when I was working as a nurse at Westlake Medical Center. James was doing his residency. There, we fell in love quickly, and when I found out I was pregnant, I was overjoyed. Matthias paused, looking up at Isabella in shock. Richard's son? Your ex-stepson? Isabella's face had gone pale. James is the twins' father, but that would make Richard the twins' grandfather, Matthias finished, his mind reeling with the implications. He returned to the letter, his voice now unsteady. When I told James about the pregnancy, he seemed happy at first, but the next day he came to me in a panic. He said his father would disown him if he had children with the daughter of a nobody. Those were the words he used. He said Richard had plans for him, connections to important families that would advance his career, and that I would ruin everything. I was hurt and angry. I told him I didn't need him or his father's money. That's when he told me something that chilled me to the bone. He said his father had a vendetta against a woman named Isabella Montero, who had humiliated him years ago. When he learned my last name was Rodriguez, he became obsessed with the idea that I might be connected to someone from Isabella's past, someone named Matthias Rodriguez. I told him I didn't know what he was talking about, that my father had never mentioned anyone named Isabella Montero. But James didn't believe me. He said his father had been tracking Matthias Rodriguez for years, waiting for an opportunity. Matthias stopped reading again, his hands now visibly shaking. Richard has been tracking me. But why? Control, Isabella said quietly. It's always been about control with Richard. If he couldn't control me, he wanted to control everything around me, including anyone I ever cared about. Mateus nodded grimly and continued reading. James said he couldn't risk being part of his father's obsession. He left that night and never came back. I tried calling him for weeks, but he changed his number. I even went to his apartment, but he had moved out. I was alone and heartbroken, but I had the babies to think about. I decided then that they would be better off never knowing their father or the Hayes family. But lately, as my time grows short, I've been thinking about what's best for Sophia and Miguel. They deserve to know their heritage, even the parts of it that aren't pretty. And you deserve to know the truth about the man who abandoned us. There's one more thing, Papa. I found out recently that James is back in the city, working at Central Memorial Hospital. If something happens to you, if you ever need help with the twins, you might consider contacting him. Not Richard, never Richard. But James was a coward, not a monster. And he is their father. I love you, Papa. Take care of my babies. Tell them about me sometimes. Love always, Elena. Mateus folded the letter slowly, tears streaming down his face. All this time, she was carrying this burden alone. Isabella moved to sit beside him, wrapping an arm around his shoulders. She was protecting you, Mateus, and the twins. But why would Richard track me for decades, Mateus asked, still struggling to make sense of it all. We never even met. Isabella's expression hardened. Because you were the one thing he could never compete with, the man I truly loved. He knew that no matter how successful he became, no matter how much power he accumulated, he would never have my heart the way you did. The confession hung in the air between them, the first time either had openly acknowledged the depth of their feelings. And now his son is the father of my grandchildren, Mateus said, the irony of it all not lost on him. It's like fate has been weaving this twisted web all along, which explains why Richard seemed to know about you and the twins so quickly, Isabella realized. Someone at the hospital must have recognized you and told James, who told Richard. Mateus stood up and began pacing. What do we do now? Should I contact James, tell him I know the truth? Not yet, Isabella cautioned. Richard is already making moves against me. If he discovers we know about James's connection to the twins, there's no telling what he might do. But what about the twins? Don't they deserve to know their father? Mateus asked, torn between his instinct to protect the babies and his belief that family connections mattered. They will know him, Isabella assured him. But right now, our priority has to be keeping them safe. From Richard and from the CPS investigation he's likely orchestrated. Mateus nodded slowly. You're right. First we secure my guardianship, then we decide what to do about James. Isabella took his hand. We'll get through this, Mateus. Whatever Richard throws at us, we'll face it together. The intimacy of the moment was palpable. 30 years of separation fell away as they stood, hands clasped, united by circumstances neither could have imagined. I never stopped loving you, Mateus admitted softly. Not for a single day. Isabella's eyes glistened with tears. Nor I you, she whispered. Their lips met in a gentle kiss, hesitant at first, then with growing certainty. It was both an echo of their youthful passion and something entirely new, tempered by time, loss, and the wisdom that comes from both. When they parted, Isabella rested her forehead against his. Stay with me tonight, she murmured. Not for anything, but to hold each other. I've missed you for too long, Mateus nodded, drawing her close. I'm not going anywhere, Isa, not this time. Across town, in a luxurious high-rise apartment, Richard Hayes poured himself a generous glass of scotch as he waited. The doorbell rang, and he smiled in satisfaction. Right on time, he remarked, opening the door to reveal his son, James. James. Hayes, at 35, bore a striking resemblance to his father. The same sharp features and calculated eyes, though his carried a hint of uncertainty that Richard's lacked. This better be important, James said tersely, stepping inside. I was in the middle of rounds. It is, Richard assured him, handing him a drink. I've found them. James froze, glass halfway to his lips. Found who? Elena Rodriguez's father, Richard replied, savoring the shock on his son's face. And by extension, your children, the Glass slipped from James's hand, shattering on the marble floor. "What are you talking about? I don't—" "Save it," Richard cut him off coldly. "I've known about your little indiscretion for quite some time. What kind of father would I be if I didn't keep tabs on my own son?" James sank into a chair, his face ashen. "How did you find out?" "I have eyes and ears everywhere," Richard said, dismissively. "The important thing is what we do now." "We don't do anything," James insisted, regaining some composure. "I walked away from that situation 2 years ago. It's in the past." Richard laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Nothing is ever truly in the past, son, especially not when it can be useful in the present." He pulled out his phone and showed James photos. Mateus and Isabella leaving the hospital, the twins being carried into Isabella's mansion, Mateus and Isabella sitting close together on her patio. "Your twins are living with Isabella Montero," Richard said, watching his son's reaction carefully. "The woman who destroyed our family's reputation, and their grandfather appears to be quite close to her." James stared at the photos, his expression unreadable. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because it's time you stepped up and claimed what's yours," Richard stated. "Those children are Hayes' heirs. They belong with us, not with some washed-up construction worker and his billionaire savior." "I gave up any right to those children when I walked away," James said, his voice hollow. "Rights can be reclaimed," Richard countered smoothly, "especially with the right legal team. You're their biological father. With my resources behind you, we could easily win custody." James looked up, suspicion in his eyes. "This isn't about the twins at all, is it? This is about your vendetta against Isabella Montero." Richard's smile turned predatory. "Let's call it a mutually beneficial arrangement. You get your children, I get my revenge, and Isabella Montero loses everything she cares about, just as she once did to me. And Elena's father, what happens to him?" "Collateral damage," Richard said with a shrug. "He should have stayed away from Isabella." James stood up, disgust evident on his face. "You're using innocent children as pawns in your revenge fantasy. That's a new low even for you." "Don't be so sanctimonious," Richard snapped. "You abandoned those children before they were even born. You don't get to claim the moral high ground now." The accusation landed like a physical blow. James flinched, unable to deny the truth of it. "Think about it," Richard pressed, sensing his son's vulnerability. "Those children are growing up right now without their father. Is that what you want for them? To never know who you are?" James hesitated, clearly torn. "Just meet them," Richard suggested, his voice softening into something almost paternal. "See for yourself, then decide." After James left, Victoria arrived, finding Richard in a celebratory mood. "I take it the meeting with your son went well?" she asked, accepting the champagne he offered. "He'll come around," Richard said confidently. "The guilt of abandoning his children is eating him alive." "All he needed was a little push." Victoria raised her glass. "To family reunions," she toasted sarcastically, "and the downfall of Isabella Montero." "Speaking of which," Richard said, "how are things progressing with the board?" Victoria smiled, coldly. "My contact says they're ordering an independent audit of the Rivera properties. The contamination will be confirmed, of course, thanks to our friends at the testing company." "Perfect," Richard nodded in satisfaction. "By the time they realize they've been manipulated, Isabella will have been removed as CEO, and you'll have reclaimed your father's company." "And what about the personal angle?" Victoria asked. "This Mateus person and the babies?" "That's where James comes in," Richard explained. "Once he files for custody, the ensuing scandal will be the final nail in Isabella's coffin. The board won't tolerate their CEO being involved in a messy custody battle with the son of her ex-husband." Victoria laughed. "It's deliciously complicated. I almost feel sorry for her." "Don't," Richard advised grimly. "She showed no mercy when she exposed my affairs and pushed me out of the company. She deserves everything that's coming to her." What neither of them realized was that James Hayes had not left the building. Standing in the hallway outside Richard's apartment, he had heard every word of their conversation through the door he had deliberately left ajar. His father had always underestimated him, always assumed that because James followed his path into medicine, he shared Richard's ruthless nature. It was a miscalculation that would prove costly. James pulled out his phone and made a call. "Dr. Chen, it's James Hayes. I need a favor, and it's urgent. It concerns 2 infant patients you saw recently, Sophia and Miguel Rodriguez." The next morning, Isabella awoke to find Mateus already up and gone from the bed where they had slept, holding each other through the night. She found him in the nursery, watching the twins as they slept. "They look so peaceful," she said softly, coming to stand beside him. "They do," he agreed. "It's hard to believe that they're at the center of such a complicated situation." Isabella wrapped an arm around his waist. "We'll protect them, Mateus, no matter what." Before he could respond, her phone rang. It was George calling with news that sent a chill down her spine. "The independent testing confirmed contamination at the Rivera properties," he told her grimly. "The board is calling an emergency meeting this afternoon to discuss your position." "That's impossible," Isabella insisted. "Those properties were thoroughly vetted before the acquisition." "I know," George agreed. "I reviewed the reports myself. Something isn't right here, but the board is in a panic. The potential liability is enormous." After hanging up, Isabella explained the situation to Mateus. "Richard is making his move," she concluded. "He's trying to push me out of my own company." "What can we do?" Mateus asked, his concern evident. "Fight," Isabella said simply. "It's all I know how to do." As they discussed strategies, the doorbell rang. Rosa answered it and returned looking puzzled. "There's a Dr. Hayes here to see you both," she announced. "He says it's about the twins." Mateus and Isabella exchanged alarmed glances. "James," they said in unison. "Show him in," Isabella instructed, her mind racing. James Hayes entered the room with the cautious air of someone approaching a wild animal. He was handsome in a polished way, his doctor's coat still on, as if he had come directly from the hospital. "Ms. Montero," he greeted formally, then turned to Mateus. "Mr. Rodriguez, thank you for seeing me. You've got a lot of nerve showing up here," Mateus said, his voice tight with controlled anger. James nodded, accepting the hostility as his due. "I know, and I don't expect forgiveness. But there are things you need to know about my father and about the danger you're all in." Isabella studied him skeptically. "Why should we trust anything you say?" "Because despite what I did to Eleanor and the twins, I don't want to see innocent children used as pawns in my father's revenge scheme," James replied, "and that's exactly what he intends to do." Over the next half hour, James laid out everything. Richard's long-standing obsession with destroying Isabella, his plan to use James's biological connection to the twins as leverage, and his manipulation of the environmental reports to undermine Isabella's position at Montero Enterprises. "He wants me to file for custody," James concluded, "to create a scandal that will be the final blow to your reputation with the board." "And why are you telling us this instead of following his plan?" Mateus asked, still suspicious. A flash of pain crossed James's face. "Because I've spent the last 2 years trying to forget that I abandoned my own children out of cowardice. I won't compound that sin by using them to hurt others." He reached into his coat pocket and removed a thick folder. "These are the original environmental reports for the Rivera properties, the real ones showing no contamination. I obtained them from my father's safe. They should help you counter his claims with the board." Isabella took the folder, her expression softening slightly. "Thank you, but this doesn't resolve the issue of the twins." "No, it doesn't," James agreed, his eyes moving to the baby monitor on the table, where Miguel could be heard beginning to stir. I'd like to see them if you'll allow it." Mateus hesitated, torn between protectiveness and the knowledge that this man was the twins' father. Finally, he nodded. "They're upstairs." In the nursery, James stood frozen in the doorway, staring at the 2 tiny beings that were half him. Miguel was awake now, looking curiously at the newcomer with Elena's eyes. "They're beautiful," James whispered, a tear sliding down his cheek. "They look like her." "Yes, they do," Mateus agreed, watching James carefully. James made no move to approach the cribs, seeming to understand that he had not earned that right. "I don't deserve to be in their lives," he said softly. Not after what I did. Perhaps not, Isabella said from behind them. But they deserve to know their father, if he's willing to be the man they need him to be. James turned to face them both. I want to help protect them from my father. After that, if you're willing, maybe we could discuss some kind of arrangement. I don't expect custody, but perhaps visitation eventually. Mateus nodded slowly. We can discuss it. For now, let's focus on stopping Richard. There's one more thing you should know, James added, his expression grim. My father has been working with Victoria Rivera. Her vendetta against you matches his in intensity, if not in duration. Antonio's daughter, Isabella said, the pieces falling into place. She blames me for his suicide. Yes, James confirmed. And she's been the one falsifying the environmental reports using her connections at the testing company. As James prepared to leave, having shared everything he knew of Richard and Victoria's plans, he paused at the front door. I know it doesn't change anything, he said to Mateus, but Elena was the only woman I ever truly loved. My father threatened to destroy her career, her reputation, even implied he would harm her physically if I didn't walk away. I was a coward, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life. Mateus studied the younger man, seeing genuine remorse in his eyes. Elena believed you were a coward, not a monster, he said finally. Maybe she was right. After James left, Isabella and Mateus sat in the kitchen, processing everything they had learned. Do you think we can trust him? Mateus asked. I think we don't have much choice, Isabella replied pragmatically. The board meeting is in 3 hours, and without those original reports, I'll be removed as CEO by nightfall. And what about his request to be part of the twins' lives? Mateus pressed. Can we trust him with that? Isabella covered his hand with hers. That's your decision, Mateus. You're their guardian. But if he's sincere about changing, about standing up to his father, maybe the twins would benefit from knowing him. Mateus nodded thoughtfully. Elena wanted them to know their heritage, all of it. And despite everything, James is part of that. Whatever you decide, I'll support you, Isabella promised. But first, we need to stop Richard and Victoria. I need to get to that board meeting. As Isabella prepared to leave, gathering the documents James had provided, Mateus pulled her into a fierce embrace. Be careful, he urged. Richard is dangerous when cornered. So am I, she replied with determination, kissing him softly. It's time Richard learned that lesson once and for all. The boardroom was tense when Isabella arrived. Richard and Victoria were already there, seated side by side like monarchs presiding over an execution. The board members' expressions ranged from concern to outright hostility. Ms. Montero, Margaret Davis began formally, in light of the confirmed contamination, issues with the Rivera properties, we've convened to discuss appropriate leadership actions. Before we begin, Isabella said calmly, I'd like to distribute some information that has just come to my attention. She handed out copies of the original reports James had provided. These are the actual environmental assessments for the Rivera properties, showing no contamination issues. The reports you received earlier were falsified. A murmur ran through the board members as they reviewed the documents. Richard's face darkened. This is a desperate attempt to divert attention from her negligence, he said dismissively. Those reports could easily be the forgeries. They could be, Isabella acknowledged, which is why I've arranged for the environmental engineers who conducted the original assessments to join us via video conference. They're prepared to authenticate their work and signatures. She nodded to George, who connected the call. On the screen appeared 3 professionals who proceeded to confirm that the reports Isabella had provided were indeed their original work, showing no contamination. Furthermore, Isabella continued once the call ended, I have evidence that Mr. Hayes and Ms. Rivera conspired to undermine this company and my leadership through fraud and manipulation. She played a recording, James's voice crystal clear, detailing his father's plot. He had recorded their entire conversation the previous night, capturing every damning word of Richard and Victoria's scheme. By the time they realize they've been manipulated, Isabella will have been removed as CEO, and you'll have reclaimed your father's company, Richard's voice declared triumphantly on the recording. Victoria leapt to her feet. This is entrapment. That recording was made without consent. Actually, George interjected smoothly, New York is a one-party consent state for recordings. If James Hayes consented to record his own conversation, it's perfectly legal. Richard remained eerily calm. A son's betrayal, he mused, almost to himself. How poetic. I think we've heard enough, Margaret Davis said firmly. Mr. Hayes, Ms. Rivera, I believe your presence is no longer required at this meeting. You can't dismiss me, Victoria protested. I'm a major shareholder. A shareholder who has just been implicated in corporate espionage and fraud, Margaret countered. Security will escort you out. The board will be filing formal complaints with the appropriate authorities. As Richard and Victoria were led from the room, Richard paused beside Isabella. This isn't over, he whispered, his voice laced with menace. There are other ways to hurt you. Threaten me or anyone I care about again, Isabella replied quietly, so only he could hear, and I will destroy what's left of your life so thoroughly that even your son will forget you existed. After they left, the board voted unanimously to reaffirm their confidence in Isabella's leadership and to launch a full investigation into Richard and Victoria's actions. I apologize for doubting you, Isabella, Margaret said sincerely as the meeting concluded. Richard's manipulation was very convincing. That's always been his greatest skill, Isabella acknowledged, but it won't work anymore. As she drove home, Isabella felt a weight lift from her shoulders. Richard's vendetta had been exposed, his power neutralized. For the first time in years, she was truly free of his shadow. But as she pulled into her driveway, a police car parked outside the mansion sent a chill through her body. Something was wrong. She rushed inside to find Mateus sitting in the living room, his face ashen, Rosa beside him in tears. What happened? Isabella demanded, fear gripping her heart. They took them, Mateus said, his voice hollow with shock. Child Protective Services came with a court order. They took the twins. What? How? Isabella asked, stunned. We have the documentation. We filed everything with Johnson. It wasn't Johnson, Rosa explained through her tears. It was another worker, someone we hadn't seen before. He had papers signed by a Judge Hayes. Hayes, Isabella repeated, her blood running cold. William Hayes is a family court judge, Richard's brother. Mateus looked up, devastation and rage warring in his expression. Richard found another way to hurt us, just like he threatened. Isabella sank onto the couch beside him, taking his trembling hands in hers. We'll get them back, Mateus. I promise. You, Richard, has gone too far this time. As night fell, the mansion that had briefly felt like a home was silent and empty, the nursery dark. But in that darkness, a determination was born, a fierce, unyielding resolve to reclaim what had been taken and to ensure that Richard Hayes would never hurt them again. Across town, in a specially prepared nursery in Richard's penthouse, Sophia and Miguel slept uneasily, as if sensing they were far from those who truly loved them. Richard stood over them, a cold smile on his face. Welcome to the Hayes family, he murmured. Your real family. What he didn't know was that James was already on his way, having been alerted by Dr. Chen about the twins' removal. And behind him came Isabella and Mateus, armed with legal documents, political connections, and the kind of righteous fury that could move mountains. The final battle for the twins, and for justice, had begun. The sleek black car sped through the night, its headlights cutting through the darkness as Isabella drove with fierce determination. Beside her, Mateus stared straight ahead, his face set in stone, hands clenched into fists on his lap. My attorney is meeting us there, Isabella said, breaking the tense silence. He's bringing an emergency court order from Judge Reynolds. Will it be enough? Mateus asked, his voice rough with emotion. Richard's brother is a judge too. Reynolds outranks him, Isabella explained, and she owes me a favor. In the back seat, James Hayes checked his phone for the third time in as many minutes. No answer from my father, he reported grimly, but my uncle's clerk confirmed that he signed the removal order less than an hour after the board meeting ended. How? Quickly, Richard works when he's motivated by revenge, Isabella said bitterly, accelerating as the traffic light turned green. The memory of the empty nursery haunted them all, the abandoned stuffed animals, the silent mobiles that had played. Lullabies, the lingering scent of baby powder. Rosa had been inconsolable, blaming herself for opening the door to the CPS worker who had taken the twins. It wasn't your fault, Mateus had assured her. We were all deceived. Now, as they approached Richard's luxury high-rise, Mateus turned to James. Are you sure they're here? James nodded. My father has been preparing that nursery for weeks. It was part of his plan all along to use me to claim the twins, but to keep them under his control. He never intended for you to really have custody, Isabella realized. No, James agreed, his expression darkening. I was just another pawn, like the twins, like everyone in his life. The doorman recognized James immediately and allowed them entry without question. As they rode the elevator to the penthouse, Isabella took Mateus's hand, squeezing it reassuringly. We're going to get them back, she promised. The doors opened directly into Richard's foyer, revealing a space of cold marble and sterile luxury. From somewhere deeper in the apartment, they could hear a baby crying. Sophia, Mateus whispered, his heart racing at the sound of his granddaughter's distress. They followed the sound to a nursery that was a grotesque parody of the one they had created at Isabella's mansion. Everything designer, everything perfect and utterly devoid of warmth. Richard stood over a crib, awkwardly attempting to comfort the crying infant. He looked up as they entered, not surprised but annoyed, like they were late dinner guests rather than rightful guardians coming to reclaim children who had been essentially kidnapped. I was wondering when you'd arrive, he said calmly, straightening up. She won't stop crying. The boy at least had the good sense to fall asleep. Give me my granddaughter, Mateus demanded, stepping forward. Richard made no move to comply. These children are Hayes' heirs. They belong in this family. They already have a family, Isabella countered, her voice steel. And you're not part of it. Richard's eyes flicked to his son standing behind them. James, I see you've chosen your side. I've chosen what's right, James replied. What I should have done 2 years ago when I learned Elena was pregnant. The standoff was interrupted by the arrival of Isabella's attorney, Martin Chen, accompanied by 2 police officers and a woman in a business suit who introduced herself as Judge Reynolds's clerk. Mr. Hayes, Martin said formally, I have an emergency. Order signed by Chief Family Court Judge Reynolds, overriding the removal order for Sofia and Miguel Rodriguez. The children are to be immediately returned to the custody of their legal guardian, Mateus Rodriguez. He handed the document to Richard, who barely glanced at it before tossing it onto a nearby table. My brother's order was perfectly legal. Your brother's order, the clerk interjected, was issued without proper cause and is currently under investigation for judicial misconduct. As are you, Mr. Hayes, for manipulating the family court system for personal revenge. Richard's composed facade began to crack. These are my grandchildren, he insisted. I have rights. Rights you forfeited when you orchestrated their illegal removal from their home, Martin replied. The officers are here to ensure the children's safe return and to serve you with a restraining order. You are to have no contact with the Rodriguez family or Ms. Montero. Sophia's cries grew more insistent. Without waiting for further discussion, Mateus moved past Richard and lifted her from the crib. The moment she was in her grandfather's arms, her cries began to subside. It's okay, little one, he soothed, cradling her close. Grandpa's here now. James approached the second crib where Miguel slept. He gazed down at his son, emotion raw on his face. May I? He asked Mateus hesitantly. After a moment's consideration, Mateus nodded. With trembling hands, James gently lifted the sleeping baby. Hey there, buddy, he whispered. It was the first time he had ever held his son. Richard watched this scene unfold with growing fury. This isn't over, he threatened. I still have connections, resources. What you have, Isabella interrupted coldly, is about 5 minutes before these officers arrest you for interfering with a court order. Is that how you want this to end, Richard? In handcuffs, with reporters waiting downstairs? The mention of public humiliation seemed to finally penetrate Richard's armor. He stepped back, his expression calculating. "Take them," he said with forced indifference. "But this conversation isn't finished." "Yes, Richard, it is," Isabella stated, firmly. "You've lost. The board knows about your fraud. Your brother will likely be removed from the bench. Your reputation is in tatters. And if you ever come near my family again, I will personally ensure that what remains of your life becomes unbearable." "Your family?" Richard repeated with a mocking laugh. "Playing house with your long-lost love and his homeless grandchildren? How touching. More of a family than you ever gave me," James said quietly, still holding Miguel. "And yes, they are Isabella's family now too. All of us." Something shifted in Richard's eyes then, a flicker of understanding that he had truly lost not just the battle but his son as well. Without another word, he walked out of the nursery, leaving them to gather the twins' belongings. As they prepared to leave, James looked uncertainly at Mateus. Do you want me to give him to you?" Mateus studied the younger man, seeing both the echo of his choices and the potential of his redemption. "Keep holding him for now," he decided. "He seems comfortable with you." The relief on James's face was palpable. "Thank you." Dawn was breaking as they returned to Isabella's mansion. Rosa was waiting anxiously on the front steps and rushed forward. As the car stopped, tears of joy streaming down her face at the sight of the twins. "Gracias a Dios," she exclaimed, kissing each baby's head. "My poor angels. Were they treated well?" "They're fine," Mateus assured her. "Just tired and confused." Inside, as they settled the twins back into their proper nursery, James lingered awkwardly. "They're by the door. I should go," he said finally. "You all need time together." Mateus and Isabella exchanged a look of silent communication before Mateus turned to James. "Stay for breakfast," he offered. "We have things to discuss about your future involvement with the twins." Over coffee and Rosa's homemade breakfast, they began to sketch the outlines of a new kind of family, one built not on blood alone, but on choice and commitment. "I want to be part of their lives," James said earnestly. "Not to take them from you, but to know them, to be a father, even if I can never make up for the time I've already lost." "Elena would have wanted that," Mateus acknowledged. "But there need to be clear boundaries. They call me Grandpa. That doesn't change." "Of course," James agreed quickly. "You're their rock, their constant. I just want the chance to be something to them." Isabella, who had been quietly observing, finally spoke. "What about your practice, your life? Are you prepared to truly commit to these children?" "I've requested a transfer to the pediatric department at St. Luke's," James replied. "It's closer to here and the hours are more regular. I want to be available, consistent." As they continued talking, working through practical considerations and emotional complexities, Isabella found herself watching Mateus, his thoughtfulness, his capacity for forgiveness, his unwavering devotion to his grandchildren. Despite everything they had gone through, or perhaps because of it, her love for him had only deepened. Later, with James gone and the twins napping peacefully in their nursery, Isabella and Mateus finally had a moment alone together on the terrace overlooking the garden. "You were amazing through all of this," she told him, leaning against his shoulder. "Most people would have crumbled under the pressure." Mateus smiled tiredly. "I had you by my side. That makes all the difference." They sat in comfortable silence. For a while, both absorbing the reality that the immediate crisis had passed. Richard had been neutralized, the twins were safe, and a tentative arrangement with James had been established. "What happens now?" Mateus asked eventually. "With us, I mean." Isabella turned to face him fully. "What do you want to happen?" "I want what I've always wanted," he said simply. "A life with you. But I'm not the young man you knew, Isa. I come with complications now, with grandchildren who need stability, with a son-in-law of sorts who will be in our lives regularly." "And you think that would scare me away?" she asked with a gentle smile. "Mateus, for 30 years I've lived in a big, empty house, building a fortune that meant nothing because I had no one to share it with. Now, in just a week, this place has become a home, with babies crying at 3 in the morning, with formula stains on designer furniture, with you next to me when I wake up." Her voice softened. "I've never been happier." Mateus took her hands in his. "When we were young, I let you go because I thought I was holding you back from your dreams. I don't want to make that mistake again." "You weren't holding me back then," Isabella said, squeezing his hands. "And you're not now. You're making my life complete." He lifted one hand to brush a strand of hair from her face. "Then marry me, Isa. Not tomorrow or next week, but when we're ready. Let's make this family official." Instead of answering with words, she leaned forward and kissed him, a promise and a beginning all at once. 6 months later, Isabella's estate was transformed for a different kind of homecoming. White flowers lined the garden path, and guests mingled on the lawn under a perfect blue sky. In the master bedroom, now their shared bedroom, Isabella stood before the mirror as Rosa helped adjust her simple cream-colored dress. "You look beautiful," Rosa declared, stepping back to admire her handiwork, "like a bride should look." "Even at my age?" Isabella teased. "Especially at your age," Rosa responded firmly. "Young brides are pretty. Mature brides are beautiful. There's a difference." A soft knock at the door announced Margaret Davis, who had become not just a board ally, but a true friend through the tumultuous events of the past months. "The guests are seated," she reported. "And Mateus is waiting in the garden. He looks so nervous he might faint." Isabella laughed. "That makes 2 of us." As she made her way downstairs, she paused at the nursery door, now expanded, to accommodate the twins' growing needs. Inside, James was attempting to straighten Miguel's tiny bow tie, while Sophia, already immaculate in her flower girl dress, watched with apparent amusement. "Need some help?" Isabella asked, stepping into the room. James looked up gratefully. "Please, how do people do this? It's like trying to dress an octopus." Isabella skillfully fixed the bow tie while James held Miguel still. "Practice," she said, "and patience." Over the past months, James had proven his commitment to the twins, visiting regularly, adapting to their schedule, even taking parenting classes. The relationship between him and Mateus had evolved from tense tolerance to genuine respect, and occasionally something approaching friendship. "Thank you," James said suddenly, his expression serious. "Not just for the bow tie. For everything. For giving me a chance with the twins, for not hating me for what I did to Elena." "Elena's letter said she believed you weren't a monster, just a coward," Isabella reminded him. "You've proven her right by finding your courage now." James nodded, emotion making further words difficult. "Are you ready?" Isabella asked, scooping. Yup, Sophia, while James held Miguel. "It's time." The garden ceremony was simple and heartfelt. George Winston served as Mateus's best man, while Margaret stood with Isabella. The twins, carried by James and Rosa, preceded Isabella down the aisle. Miguel promptly falling asleep despite the occasion, Sophia wide-eyed and curious. When Isabella reached Mateus, waiting beneath an arch of white roses, the years between them seemed to fold away like pages of a book closing. They were no longer the young lovers who had parted, nor quite the middle-aged strangers who had reconnected on a cold night 6 months ago. They were something new, tempered by time, strengthened by survival, united by a love that had somehow endured despite everything. Their vows were brief but powerful. No flowery promises, just honest commitments made by 2 people who understood exactly what they were choosing and why. "I once let you go because I thought it was best for you," Mateus said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "I won't make that mistake again. Whatever comes, wherever life takes us, I'll be by your side, not just for my sake or yours, but for our family." Isabella, who had negotiated billion-dollar deals without a tremor, found her hands shaking slightly as she spoke. 30 years ago, I chose ambition over love, thinking I couldn't have both. I built an empire but lived in an empty palace. Now I know that nothing matters, no success, no achievement, no fortune, without love to give it meaning. You are my home, Mateus. You always were." As they sealed their vows with a kiss, the small gathering of friends and family applauded. Even Miguel woke up for the occasion, adding his own happy gurgle to the celebration. The reception that followed was intimate and joyful. George and Margaret danced. Rosa expertly managed the twins while still finding time to make sure everyone's glasses were filled, and James chatted comfortably with Isabella's colleagues, no longer the awkward outsider, but an accepted part of their unusual family constellation. "Look at them," Mateus said to Isabella, nodding toward the twins. Sophia was now attempting to crawl across the dance floor, while Miguel was content to be passed from one adoring guest to another. "Elena would be proud of how they're growing. She would be proud of you too," Isabella said softly, "of how you've handled everything, of the family you've created for them." "We created," he corrected her, pulling her close. "I couldn't have done any of this without you, Isa." As evening fell and the party continued around them, they slipped away to the terrace, seeking a moment alone. The garden below was illuminated with strings of lights that mirrored the stars appearing overhead. "Did you ever imagine that night when we found each other again that we'd end up here?" Isabella asked, leaning back against Mateus's chest as his arms encircled her. "Never," he admitted. "I was just trying to keep the twins alive, to find shelter for the night. The thought that you would not only help us but love us, that we'd become a family. It was beyond anything I could have dreamed." Isabella turned in his arms to face him. "Life has a way of surprising us, sometimes with challenges we never expected, and sometimes with blessings we never thought possible." From the garden they could hear the twins' laughter, as James apparently did something amusing to entertain them. Rosa's voice called out instructions, and George's deeper tones responded with good-natured grumbling. "Our family," Mateus said with wonder in his voice, "complicated, unexpected, and perfect." "And it all began because I decided to take a walk that cold night," Isabella mused. "One different choice, and we might never have found each other again." "I don't believe that," Mateus said, surprising her. "I think we were always meant to find our way back to each other. It just took time and life to prepare us for this moment." As they sealed this sentiment with a kiss, the mansion that had once been merely a symbol of Isabella's success now pulsed with the warmth and chaos of genuine family life. The empire she had built still stood, but it was no longer the center of her world. Instead, it had found its proper place as a foundation for something far more precious. In the nursery that night, after the guests had gone and the newlyweds had retired to their room, two small picture frames stood side by side on the dresser. One contained a photo of Elena, smiling bravely from her hospital bed. The other held a much older picture, a young Mateus and Isabella on a beach, laughing into the camera, their future unknown but full of hope. Between these images of past and present, the twins slept peacefully, unaware of the journey that had brought their family together, or the love that now surrounded them like a protective circle. And in their bedroom down the hall, Mateus and Isabella held each other close. No longer separated by time or circumstance or fear, the love that time had hidden had finally been revealed, stronger for its concealment, more precious for its rediscovery, and now, at last, free to flourish in the light of their shared future. "I love you, Mateus Rodriguez," Isabella whispered, in the darkness. "And I love you, Isabella Rodriguez," he replied, the new name a symbol of their united path forward. Outside, the city continued its restless pace. Stars wheeled overhead. Time moved forward, as it always must. But within the walls of what had truly become a home, a family that fate had assembled from broken pieces found their peace at last. And it was enough. More than enough. It was everything. 3 years later, on a sunny afternoon in the same garden, where they had exchanged their vows, Isabella sat on a blanket watching Mateus chase the now toddling twins across the lawn. Their laughter, both the children's and his, filled the air like music. James arrived with his new wife, Sarah, a pediatric nurse he had met at St. Luke's. Their own baby was due in 2 months, expanding their unusual family even further. "How's retirement treating you?" James asked Isabella as he joined her on the blanket. She smiled, watching as Mateus scooped up both giggling twins at once. "Perfectly. The company is in good hands with George as CEO, and I don't miss the boardroom drama one bit." "And your foundation work? That's different," Isabella acknowledged. "Helping families in crisis, providing emergency housing and support, it feels like coming full circle, like honoring the journey that brought us here. The Montero Rodriguez Family Foundation established on their first anniversary, had already helped dozens of grandparents raising grandchildren, single parents facing homelessness, and families separated by circumstances beyond their control. Helena would be proud, James said softly, watching his children play with the grandfather who had given them stability when everything else was uncertain. Yes, Isabella agreed. She would, as the afternoon light turned golden, casting long shadows. Across the lawn, Mateus returned to the blanket with two exhausted but happy toddlers. Miguel immediately climbed into James's lap, while Sophia settled between Mateus and Isabella, her small hand reaching up to touch the simple gold pendant Isabella wore, a gift from Mateus containing tiny photos of the twins. "Story, Grandma?" Sophia requested, her dark eyes, so like Elena's, looking up expectantly. Isabella exchanged a warm glance with Mateus before gathering the little girl closer. "Once upon a time," she began, "on a very cold night, a woman who thought she had everything but was really very lonely went for a walk. And as she told the story of their family, simplified for young ears, but true in all the ways that mattered, Isabella felt the circle of their love expand to embrace all of them. The lost and found, the broken and healed, the separated and reunited. The love that time had hidden had not only been revealed, but had multiplied, creating ripples of connection and healing that would continue long after their own story had ended. And in that golden afternoon light, surrounded by the family they had built together, Mateus and Isabella knew with absolute certainty that they had found what truly mattered, not in wealth or power or status, but in the simple, profound miracle of belonging to each other. "And they lived happily ever after," Sophia prompted when Isabella paused in her storytelling. "Yes, little one," Mateus answered, reaching across to take Isabella's hand. "They lived happily ever after." And so they did. The end.